You're alive.
Hey, welcome to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules meeting on June 26th. Summer break for a month.
Starts with a J.
So welcome, everyone. We have 6 rules today, and we also have a request for a change in adoption date. So full agenda. I don't know if we need to hold 2 hours. We'll see how that goes. But before we get started, let's do introductions. My left.
Damian Leonard, Office of Legislative Counsel.
Larry Sutkwitz, Representative Randolph.
Scott Beck, Senator, Caledonia Senate District.
Scott Bornberg, Senator from the Bennington Senate District.
And Rob Plunkett, Senator from the Bennington District.
Carol Odie, Representative, the north end of Burlington.
Represent First Row and represent Onion Hill and Jericho.
And we're in bias committees.
And then online,
Yeah, Representative Mark Higley from the Orleans Lamoille District.
okay. First up, we have the minutes from May 29th, 2025.
I'll move we accept those.
Representative Odie has moved to accept. Any discussion edits? Saying none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, first up, we have request for an extension of adoption deadline for Rule 24P47. You told me who you were, and I forgot.
Something's right.
Ben Montross with the Drinking Water Program.
It's not on my agenda here. Yes, fine. Good, please take a seat.
Good morning. So as I said, I'm Ben Montross. I'm with the Drinking Water Program within the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation. Thanks for taking the time to hear from us today about the important changes we're working on for the Vermont Water Supply Rule. We're here today to respectfully request a 90-day extension to the rule adoption deadline for the final proposed rule amendments for the Water Supply Rule. We started this process in November 2024. Primary changes sought with this version of the rule is to incorporate federal regulations pertaining to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS. This is in response to the federal rule, which was enacted in April of 2024, establishing maximum contaminant levels, MCLs, for certain PFAS compounds. Since the filing of this rule, there have been unprecedented uncertainty, change, and upheaval at the federal level. For example, within a month or so of being promulgated, there were multiple lawsuits filed against the rule. There have been impactful changes within the EPA administration. And last month, the EPA announced its intention to rescind and reconsider MCLs for several of the PFAS compounds listed in the federal rule and to extend the compliance dates for other aspects of the rule. So this extension will allow us time to thoroughly consider the impact these changes will have on the rule and really allow us the time so that we can carefully and intentionally develop our own rule that protects Vermont citizens. Happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Otherwise, I appreciate hearing from you this morning and you're taking the time to meet with us.
Just a couple of questions, and I posed this to you before, and that is, had discussions with others, potentially impact stakeholders by delay.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to answer all of these questions and caveat all these questions with it depends, because again, like I said, we don't have a clear direction from the federal government, so we still need to do it locally. But as it's written with the federal regulation, they will be establishing federal standards for PFOA and PFOS. Those are going to stay. So in the press release last month, EPA said that those standards are staying the same. Everything else around that is going to be moving and changing. We regulate PFAS currently for 5 compounds at 20 parts per trillion. We've done that since 2019. We've had 20-ish systems that have exceeded that state MCL. Under the federal MCLs, we would expect 20 to 25 additional systems to exceed that 4 part per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. So it would affect more systems. The good thing is that there is an unprecedented amount of federal funds currently coming through the program to address those systems. We are actively engaged with them. At least half, if not more than half, already know what they're going to do and have the funding kind of in place or lined up to address it.
Is there the potential that we may not have enough funds? If that changes.
There's that potential, certainly. The prices aren't going down for anything, especially in this sphere, because there will be national draw and national need for this equipment. We are out ahead of it. Like I said, we've got a 6-year head start, which is good. So we know where we are. The vast majority of the rest of the country hasn't even started sampling. So we're hoping that we can get the money where we need to now. We have enough to address those that are above the MCL. Those that are below the MCL that have PFAS, we may not have money to help address those situations.
Other committee members? Okay. I'll entertain a motion.
Please, that's what, just,
Okay.
what impact, to the extent that you said, those 2 areas are staying the same, but everything else is swirling around, what potential impact does that have on us and your ability to promulgate rules?
So there's a couple of different ways to answer that. From a process standpoint, we largely rely on the federal language and point to it and say, we're going to do these little differences, but otherwise follow them. If we're pointing there, which is a moving target, that's a lot of what we need this time for. So we're going to, an option is to take it out of the federal, write it into the state, and just make it state law.
So you have that within the confines of law, you have the ability to do that.
It's an option, certainly,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
The good thing about that also is that because we have a 6-year head start with this, we know what we're up against. We know what the contamination is, and predominantly our concerns are PFOA and PFOS. The other things that are moving around, we do see those chemicals, but they're not the driver. They're not the ones that are creating the non-compliance in situations. So we're less dependent on that for certainty than we are on the PFOA and PFOS standards.
And with that, I don't want to beat this horse, but will you also, because the federal regulations, even though you think those two are going to stay where they are, is always a bit of a moving target at this point, are we writing it in such a way that they'll withstand that change at the federal level?
It's an option. We haven't actually put the pen to paper to do that. That's certainly an option. We can be more stringent than the federal regulations, so that's something we could do. This current standard in the federal regulation is based on basically what the labs can show nationwide with a repeatable, predictable manner. So they're pretty much as low as they can be reasonably. It's not to say in 10 years when the labs get better, they might. So it's going to be an evolving landscape. They're considered emerging contaminants. So there is a chance for this all to move.
Motion to allow them to fix the exemption.
So there's a motion to approve the extension. And any more discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
By the way, that extension is till October 20th, 2025. We have Ashley Berliner.
Connor O'Day is gonna appear in place of
Oh.
Ashley.
Also shows, okay. Hour day. All right, so next up is going to be Rule 24, P48, Person-Centered Planning, Home and Community-Based Services. So these are the 2 rules that we were so brutally interrupted by a fire alarm many weeks ago. You're up, Connor.
All right, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you this morning. So just as introduction, as was noted, there are two rules for your review. We have the HCAR person-centered planning and the critical incident management system. These rules are part of the Agency of Human Services' ongoing effort to consolidate all Medicaid regulations within our healthcare administrative rules, known as HCAR, and to ensure alignment with the federal requirements that are brought to home and community-based services. So we shared this rule with internal and external stakeholders prior to filing the rule with ICAR, and we did not receive any comments. We filed this rule with ICAR in September of 2024. On 10/24, ICAR approved our ongoing with rulemaking, and we filed with the Secretary of State in late November. We did our public hearing in January. There were no attendees. And then during the public comment period, we did receive comments from our Vermont Care Partners, known as VCP, on just the person-centered planning rule. We determined that the comments were outside the scope of the person-centered planning process rule, and we did not make changes to the rule based on those comments. So in summary, this proposed rule for the person-centered planning, this is a new rule. It aligns with federal regulations on person-centered planning for delivering home and community-based services under our CMS-approved Global Commitment to Health waiver. It outlines the requirements for planning processes, service plans, and annual reviews. Additionally, it specifies the documentation needed to support any modification to qualities of a home and community-based setting affecting individual rights. And just for some context, the language of person-centered planning and service plan. I think, in the medical world, you might hear treatment plan that is put together in terms of the directives of what services the individual is going to receive, what is authorized, how much of the service, when, and whom is going to be delivered by. Person-centered plan is in a service plan encapsulates all of that with some additional items to really drive how is the person going to be served in the community and be supported to remain living in community and outside of an institution in the setting that is of their choice. So yeah, that is our person-centered planning, and we'll stop there before going into the critical incident system. If there are any questions?
Connor, I just wanted to highlight for you, I realize it's been a while now. In our exchanges with my colleague Jen Carby and yourself and Ashley prior to the rule, Ashley had indicated that you would be replacing the word comprise in the lead-in language to section 8.103.3 with the word include, and I just wanted to confirm that on the record.
Absolutely, confirmed. Yes. Yep, that is our intent.
Great. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next questions? Motion? What's that?
Move approval.
Well, I would read this. I move that we approve Agency of Human Services person-centered planning, home and community-based services with modifications proposed by.
Motion.
Okay, thank you. Any additional discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. On to 24P49, Critical Incident Management System, Home and Community-Based Services. You're up.
All right, great. So thank you. And again, this is a new rule, and it sets forth Medicaid's responsibilities under federal regulations 42 CFR 441302A6. And what this requires states to do is implement and operate and maintain an incident management system that protects the health and welfare of individuals receiving home and community-based services again, those services that are authorized under Vermont's Global Commitment to Health waiver. This rule sets the minimum requirements of an incident management system so that it identifies, reports, triages, allows for investigation, resolution, tracking, and the trends of critical incidents. So this is an electronic system that really what it does is it allows for a reporting mechanism for our community-based organizations when an incident occurs to be able to report that to the state. And the state has all of its defined policy on how to then appropriately respond, investigate, mitigate future risk of ongoing incident, so as to, again, really in the vein of health and safety of those beneficiaries that are receiving services under the home and community-based services programs. So with that, any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Ready? Questions, comments?
Sorry, Connor, one more along the same lines as before. Just for the record here, in our discussions, you and Ashley had indicated that you'd be including a comma or an and in section 9.101.5 between the phrase completing investigations and the phrase determining resolution.
Yes,
Is that correct? Great.
that is correct.
All right. That's all for me. Thank you.
Any other questions? The comments from Ledge Council were find those in your last set of comments from,
Yeah, I forgot to include them in this email.
nothing's changed. So anyway, having no questions or comments, is your motion?
Yes, I'll move that we approve 24-P49 Agency of Human Services Critical Incident Management System, Home and Community-Based Services with modifications proposed by the agency and we spoke of.
Motion from Representative Odie to approve the rule. Any additional discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Thank you, Connor.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Next up, we have a set of 4 rules. Cannabis, and it must be Gabriel Gilman.
I am.
And so we'll start with Rule 25, P02, Rule 1, licensing of cannabis establishments. And I suspect it might be easier if we just do a rule at a time,
Yes, I think that would probably make sense.
and then we'll vote.
Yes, I can kind of follow your lead in terms of if you'd like my big more on this.
100% the first rule. Go for that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm Gabriel Gilman. I'm general counsel to the Cannabis Control Board. We have a set of 4 closely related rules that are really our entire body of administrative rules. The adult use market, as you probably are aware, opened in October 22. And so each year since, we have learned some things, tried to improve the way we serve people, to improve the quality of our processes. And so this is the 3rd version of that. I think say we've adhered very closely to the plan approved by the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules to maximize public input. That resulted in a lot of public input. We really had, this was really kind of a community event. It's a close-knit, competitive group of cannabis establishments very interested in these rules. I think that's reflected in the volume of commentary you got. It's also reflected in the seriousness with which the board took those comments. It's also reflected in the considerable number of amendments between the proposal and what we have for you today. So I think one of the most important things that I can do is walk through, explain the substantive changes from top to bottom and emphasize areas that were controversial or that resulted in substantial changes between the proposed rule and the text that you have now, and explain why that exists. If you have questions from your constituents about the rules or any concerns, please feel free to interrupt me as I go at any point. Similarly, if you'd like me to slow down and talk about something I may have glossed over or to move on from something I'm dwelling on, please just go ahead and interrupt at will. The board's first rule of the four rule set concerns the licensing process applicable to cannabis establishments. Turning to the first substantive change, there's a definition added for governing documents. This is part of an effort by the board to streamline the way it does license renewals in particular. Our first effort at that looked a lot like making people do the initial application over again every year, and they hated it, and so did we. So we've tried to capitalize on the documents we already have and move more to a system instead of annual submission of everything from the top, a system of continuous maintenance of relevant documents with the agency. So you sort of have a record, and if things change about your operation, you're required as a cannabis establishment to keep the regulator aware. And by doing that, we save people a lot of work with these annual renewals, which we're getting a lot of feedback. We're just too paperwork heavy and often redundant. So that's a little change, but it goes toward a big shift in regulatory approach from the agency that I think you'll see reflected throughout. I'll gloss over some of the other technical areas that pre-qualification and approval, for example, is no longer defined because there is no longer such a thing. That was a system that served us well when we needed to stand up a surge of people at the beginning. It's no longer, in fact, now it sort of creates redundancy in the sense among staff as well as the feedback from licensees is you're basically making us do something twice, please make us do it once. And that's where we are there. So that's just sort of an ordinary streamlining effort. There is a new rule proposed that a license application is dormant for 90 days may be dismissed. This is 1.2.3. Inevitably, if you have a bureaucracy with a process like this, some people will not go through, they'll get jammed up, and they just need clarity about when the time has run. So that's really what that's about. There's a clarification in 1.3.1 about how canopy is calculated. That's just to avoid dispute and to remove ambiguity from the old way things were done. At 1.3.4, you have a substantive change, which is the board proposes that its rules allow it to sort of compel a licensee that is not using canopy commensurate with its level of licensure to move into the category that's appropriate for it. The reason that's important is one of the board's tasks is to regulate the net canopy in the market. And if people are permitted to sort of hoard licensing canopy, others unused, it really frustrates their ability. If there's this kind of reserve capacity, it really frustrates the board's ability to regulate the market in the way I think the General Assembly asked them to. So that's why you see this new authority. And it's really just meant to, when people won't voluntarily true up their license to their actual operation, it would allow the board to say, you have to, I'm going to renew you an applicable tier. There's considerable discussion and feedback about that rule, none of it very contentious, just people, talking very productively about avoiding unintended consequences, and I think they've nailed that one. 1.3.5 is a similar reassignment, just in the other direction. Let's see. There's more in 1.4 about governing documents, further to the shift in philosophy and approach that I had spoken about earlier. Mostly technical changes to the insurance, taxation, and banking requirements, 1.4.5. Notably, though, everyone will have to have insurance and banking at this juncture. When the market was stood up a few years ago, there was real uncertainty about whether or not deposit institutions and insurers would be willing to take the risks associated with the industry. That uncertainty has been resolved kind of happily. We have a pretty competitive market for financial services as well as insurance services to these licensees. Could be more competitive than insurance, and I think we maybe wish it were, but the worry that motivated the original alternatives was you just won't be able to find a deposit account. That's simply not true. We're really in good shape with a lot of credit unions and banks choosing to be in the market. So that's why you see what you do there. There are some changes to security rules. One of them is to just add a little bit of flexibility. We were finding, for example, that outdoor cultivators in rural Vermont we're not very well protected by the requirement that they fence something that's so deep in the woods that, you know, anybody with a pickup truck and pickaxe could be through the fence. There's just nothing, you know, there are just better ways to protect that sort of thing. So some flexibility added to the security related licensing requirements that you see. Technical additions of the term propagation cultivator. This is around 1.5.3. That's just because there's a new license type and its existence should be reflected when discussing those. A substantive change comes in at 1.7.1. This is the medical use endorsement authorized by the General Assembly last year. And so the way it had been for sort of cannabis dispensaries that did medical cannabis and adult use, what we call adult use cannabis establishments, but everybody in the real world called dispensaries too, to our chagrin. But they never met. There was adult use, there was medical, and you didn't do the same thing. There was a predicted decline in interest in and participation in the medical market that resulted in some real concern about access to medical stuff for patients. And we have people saying, listen, the people that are ill and least able to travel have to travel the most to go get some exotic place to be served, where they could be surrounded with 3 other adult use cannabis establishments on their block. You know, what are you doing? So the solution to that was pretty clear. It was to create a system where an adult use establishment that met certain requirements could serve medical patients. It's a little bit complicated because it requires different training for folks. It also invites tax evasion, for example, in an effort to avoid the excise tax. And so it's very important that those establishments be sort of auditable by us and by the Department of Taxes, and that the staff be trained not to abuse the ability to serve medical patients, for example, by allowing straw purchases where somebody's just, you know, avoiding the tax for his buddies, frustrating the purposes of the General Assembly in both in imposing the tax and in restricting somewhat the potency of adult use products. So by doing that, we make sure we have sort of a clean system, but I think it's looked at as a very positive step by almost everybody in the industry. People that were very concerned about medical access see this as a big relief, and I think a lot of retailers are eager to serve that market as well. So I think it's been generally greeted with relief and positive feedback. Geographic distribution at 1.7.2 is a little bit of a sleeper. It doesn't look like much, but it reflects probably the biggest going on in the rule. When we set out to write this rule, our original task after last year's miscellaneous cannabis bill was for the first time to write citing requirements for retail cannabis establishments. The sense was they were concentrating in ways that were not helpful. Because there was an opt-in and opt-out vote, a mandatory opt-in vote by the voters of each town, a town that hasn't had one of those can't be home to a retail cannabis establishment. So if you have a metropolitan area like Burlington, where you're like 5, 6 municipalities that really make up the area, if only a handful, 1 or 2 opts in, all of the metropolitan demand is going to come to bear on that particular municipality, resulting in concentrations that they really weren't thrilled about. And the sense was it would be better to have more control over that process than the board originally did, or originally did not have citing authority to say you can put your retail store there, but not there. So that was granted to it last year. And when we set out on this rulemaking project, the plan was we're going to come up with the grand citing rule. You know, we're going to get everybody together. We're going to have a, you know, compromise between the stakeholders that everybody can live with, that works for municipal officials, works for entrepreneurs, works for the incumbent licensees as well. That didn't really come to pass. We took a shot at a very municipality-centered rule. It wasn't very popular. I think people sort of said, you know, it's just a more nuanced thing than you can do by simply imposing ratios to population. A reason for that is really the kind of gateway community principle, where if you have a town, the Stowe, for example, has not been. It's surrounded by gateway communities on the Waterbury side and then to its north. And so you see concentrations there that seem very abnormal, but actually reflect supply being demand. And so I think we took the feedback that we got seriously, and most of that feedback was slow down. Let's do this a little bit more carefully. And direct feedback from the General Assembly in this year's, what is now Act 56, was H321. Was to change the evaluative process so that we include local feedback. That was built into this year's miscellaneous cannabis bill.
there's basically an instruction by the General Assembly to go back to the drawing board on that subpart, involve municipal officials and, talk with them because they're kind of left out of this in a way. And I think the feeling that municipalities would have more zoning control and more control of their own destinies if they opted in would actually have a beneficial effect of having more opt-in so that we saw, more territory upon which these businesses could distribute. Right now, Barry mentioned, the board has paused acceptance of of all new license applications in retail and most cultivation. So it isn't that this problem is growing and growing. It's really just that before we open that window back up, we want to have in place a rule that works for everybody. And the consensus was that's going to take another year. And now we're operating under new instructions after H321. So that was it. The big reveal was meant to be this citing rule, and it's not here. What we have in 1.7.2 is a simpler rule about how the board is to deal with existing retailers seeking to relocate. And in so many words, the rule says, if you don't make concentration worse, we'll greenlight relocation. If you're relocating in such a way that aggravates an already over-concentrated area, the board may put a red light on it and ask you to consider a different area. Relocation is not that common, so I don't see this being used very much before we ultimately have the citing rule, but we do want to cover that contingency if individuals want to amend their licenses to locate in a different place. So that's why you see what you see there. Most of 1.10 is cleanup. 1.11 concerns the background checks that are given to people before they can enter the cannabis marketplace as either principals and controllers or employees of cannabis establishments. The background checks applicable to principals and controllers are a little bit more complicated. Those applicable to employees a little bit lighter weight. But the basic idea is that nobody comes into the marketplace without at least a cursory criminal background check, et cetera. What you see in 1.11 is an effort to add flexibility to the analytical process about who can get in and who can't. In the original version, we hitched ourselves to the so-called listed crimes in Title 13. They don't map really well to the kind of stuff you'd want to keep out of the cannabis marketplace. They omit a lot of, if you look at the lists of illicit crimes in Title 13, they, focus on, on certain crimes, we ignore almost entirely things like embezzlement or financial frauds, that kind of thing, where if you had somebody who had repeated convictions for that sort of thing at the felony level, they're probably not fit for licensure, but because we had fixated on listed offenses, we would have to look right at it. We would have to look right at it. It would have no basis upon which to withhold the license. So we think this makes a lot of sense. Just adds a little bit of flexibility to that system. I should add that's a contested case system, so it isn't unobserved decision making by the board. Everyone has a right, if they get an adverse result, to appeal first to an administrative officer for free. An administrative appellate officer for free, and then to the Vermont Supreme Court if they're unsuccessful before the officer. So quite a few procedural protections of just the board smiling or frowning at people as it sees fit. And also some careful rules about what standards are being applied. So 1.13, this also moves with a kind of shift in philosophy. Instead of pre-qualification process that was appropriate during the surgeon licensees at the beginning of the market, we now just have this short mandatory orientation. We want to show people how to work with our computer system. That takes some redundancy out of the application process. It used to be that everyone had to do this pre-qualification process, get presumptive and cleared, go through another hurdle. It was found by those folks and us to be unnecessary now that we're in a more mature market. And so that's really just an efficiency measure. The social equity designation, 1.13.4, is just meant to take some ambiguities out of the definition of the social equity applicant. Those were developed by the General Assembly with the goal of assisting people from communities historically disadvantaged, unfairly treated by cannabis prohibition. Most of what you see here reacts to kind of ways that we didn't think people might wiggle in there. For example, if you while you own a cannabis establishment, if you marry someone else who owns a cannabis establishment or enter into a domestic partnership with such a person, and that person had a relative who served time for cannabis 20 years ago, all of a sudden you would get a fee waiver, and that didn't make almost no sense. It just wasn't reaching the population. So it really just meant to curb kind of loopholes and whatnot. We did not see significant abuse of it, but nonetheless, as time wore on, we learned a few ways that people could qualify that didn't match the intent of the General Assembly. So they had proposed narrowing things up. So some procedural changes that probably don't bear detailed discussion. 1.15.2 concerns the process for managing untimely and incomplete renewals. That has proven to be a real challenge. So the agency just needs some ways to kind of manage and deter very late applications or people letting their licenses come, frighteningly close to expiration. With the license comes the ability to possess what would otherwise be felony amounts of cannabis. So if the license becomes inactive, that's a really big deal. We don't want to see that happen. But we get very nervous when people run right up to the deadline. So what you see there are really just procedures to do that a little bit more effectively. Let's see. Provisions about identification cards are primarily technical. 1.16.5 is now marked reserved and stricken. There was a process of temporary work permits. Again, that was fit for the surge of applicants. It's no longer necessary because the administrative staff can get those out within days. So it's just not necessary to have this two-step process where we get this temporary thing, have to come back to the agency, which people often forget to do, or that their employers would have find it burdensome to supervise whether or not the employees did. So that's really an efficiency measure, no longer necessary to have that process. Notably, it was driven by a statute that the General Assembly has stricken in H321. So the obligation to have that temporary system is gone legally, and what you see there is just the reflection of that in administrative rule. 1.17 is another kind of shift toward efficiency and effort to kind of rationalize our system. We had a confusing process when existing licensees wanted to change things about their license, either where they were operating from or who the significant stakeholders were, both of which are things the board regulates. The former system called for what was called confusingly an early renewal, even though the license might have been issued a month before you found out you had a new stakeholder. It was pretty burdensome. It was just confusing conceptually. What we've moved into is describing efforts or applications either removed or have new shareholders as license amendments. And so people have been issued a license and removed any idea that it has anything to do with expiration dates or duration of licensure. It was just creating confusion and causing prorating problems and fees. So what we have now is a system where if you're going to make a substantial change to the regulated aspects of your cannabis establishment, you file a request to amend your license with the board. The board approves or denies that, subject to all of the procedural protections and appeal rights of any other contested case. So there's a lot there, but it's all moving in the same direction. At 1.18, you see the removal of some waiver provisions for tier 1 cultivators. This also reflects maturation of the market. The board and the General Assembly directed us to really be as welcoming as any cannabis regulator possibly could be to the smallest tier cannabis cultivators, people that were, starting with limited means and starting with limited square footage and canopy, really nurturing a local craft market. That succeeded wonderfully. We have now hundreds and hundreds of cultivators that dwarfs anything going on in other states. I tell people when I talk to my colleagues in Connecticut, they'd say, why do you guys spend so much time regulating cultivators? And we have 3 of them. So we just call them on the phone. We tell them to please, change what you're doing. And, we have 400 very diverse folks out there in the world taking all different approaches to the marketplace. So that's really, but the waivers that basically exempted that group from all kind of startup rules just aren't necessary at this juncture. They're in the market. They're already qualified. So that's really just a modernization you see there. And that brings us to the end of Rule 1 of 4. Is there anything that anybody would like me to revisit there, or any questions or concerns about the
There was a document distributed this morning that indicated all the changes that were requested. I don't think any of them were substantive, were they?
No, they're all just technical.
So if you haven't seen that, was it in the packet?
Yes.
Okay, so you have a copy of that. Any questions on Rule 1 from committee members? Comments? I'll entertain a motion.
I'll move this one.
Representative Sackwitz.
I move that we approve Cannabis Control Board Rule 1, licensing of cannabis establishments as amended by the memorandum submitted on June
25th.
2025.
Motion for Representative Sackwitz to approve the rule. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Did you vote, Representative Higley? Okay. All right, thank you. So now we have 25 PO3, Cannabis Control Board Rule 2 of this is the regulation of cannabis establishments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just again, for the record, Gabe Gelman, General Counsel for the Cannabis Control Board. This is the second of 4 closely related rules by way of kind of planning your caffeine intake. This contains the most substantive changes. Rules 3 and 4 are much more lightweight than the first 2. But I'll do as I did with Rule 1 and just walk you through substantive changes from the top. I should, at this point, also thank Legislative Counsel for detecting a number of typographical and technical errors, all the punctuation and whatnot that evaded us. So we sent you a memo about that. There are 2 cross-references in this Rule 2, that I want to remember to revisit with you before we ask for approval of this rule. They're super technical, but I just want to get them and finish up. Again, with thanks to Legislative Counsel for detecting those that got biased. So Rule 2 is really the big rule. It's the rule that tells the establishments how to operate and sets down the ground rules for the different types of licenses. The first change in the definitions you see is the addition of medical product as a definition. That is part and parcel of this new plan that will be able to issue medical use endorsements to retail cannabis establishments. The term just helps us to it gives us a thing with which to describe those things that can be sold to people with a medical card, not to other customers. The business records provision at 221 is part and parcel of the streamlining that I had talked about earlier. It just tells businesses what they need to keep in their active records. Escrow in lieu of insurance is now stricken, similar to the reasons that I talked about in Rule 1. The market has met that need. There is insurance available, and so also it seems to be very ineffective to ask people to escrow money. Generally speaking, the amount of cash that one is ready to escrow just doesn't come close to to a policy limit, a conventional liability policy. So all of that goes to just having more effective regulation and ending the system that really wasn't necessary. In terms of 224, the rule governing health, safety, and sanitation, will have a new provision that was recommended by our enforcement folks to exclude pets and animals from all areas used for cannabis processing, manufacturing, or storage. Notably absent from that list is cultivation. So your dog can still go with you if you're in the field, but it shouldn't be just in keeping with the basic food safety and manufacturing principles. That only makes sense. The employment and training regulations are clarified just because they were creating confusion about which trainings employees versus principals and controllers had to take. Nothing too substantive there. There is a requirement now proposed for 226, the rule on tracking, that limits somewhat who may access the inventory tracking system. It encountered some inappropriate delegations by businesses that would say, well, I've just given this person, I've given my account and my passwords, and they did the thing. I can't explain how it happened. So now this just clarifies that if you share your credentials with a business partner or professional service provider, you're responsible for what's done under those credentials. There's pretty much common sense on that one. Let's see, 227 G now calls for a standard form, transport form. It had been that businesses were told you have to have a transport manifest, but there was no standardization of what it looked like. So it's hard to see how that would help a police officer at the side of the road who's trying to say, is this a printable thing? We now will have a standard form. Based on feedback from industry, we did create a carve out for folks that already have developed in their IT systems, mature forms. They're not going to have to go back and incur the expense of redoing that work just for being particularly conscientious about it the first go. Packaging and branding 2.2.9. This is an area that relates to many of the public comments that you have seen in the pack. The original proposal, we like cannabis regulators all over are kind of challenged by co-branding efforts that muddy the jurisdictional lines where you might have a nationally promoted cannabis brand, but those brands are regulated state by state and nothing crosses state borders. And so we ran into some problems, really accountability problems, where we had in-state licensees using brands of which they were not the exclusive controller under licensing agreements. It had some potential to create confusion for consumers about what they were buying and from whom. And it also had the regulatory risk for us because this General Assembly in this state has told us we want particular advertising restrictions that are protective of children, that avoid false health claims, et cetera. Not every state has done that. And the federal oversight, as you know, is not. They're basically abstaining from this area. So the concern was if you had somebody in Vermont that you regulated who affiliated themselves with a brand but then violated your advertising laws by advertising during the Super Bowl to children or something, you wouldn't be able to hold them accountable for that. The original plan was, the proposal as it went out was simply to disallow the use of branding that didn't correspond to a license name or DBA. That met with a lot of concern and opposition from a small number of people who mostly were doing innocuous, innovative things in the marketplace, but who would have been put out of business by it. And so this was the subject of a lot of discussion between the board, its licensees, about how to solve this problem without causing undue injury to small businesses. And we think we threaded the needle. You'll see a lot of concern expressed in the original public input based on the original text. But I think I can represent to you that everybody I know who was panicked about it really likes where this landed. We think, and I think the board feels like it solved its problem. And I think that the folks that were doing more complex branding arrangements that were not harmful, not the kind we wanted to prevent, feel that they can operate safely and continue their businesses. So this is sort of what you see now in 229. This is little 4, 8 and 4. I think really does represent kind of the best of participatory rulemaking, and that everybody got and fixed something so that we didn't have unintended consequences. And although you see a lot of writing about it, most of that writing has been addressed in a way that I think is satisfactory to the commenters. And subsidy is part and parcel of the same thing. There's a new, this is deep in the woods, but there's this an organization called ASTM that creates standards for so many of the logos and warnings that we see in daily life and plastered on things. They had a standard, they've developed a standard contains THC warning that they really feel is important to push down as the standard globally, so that there is not confusion among people when they travel about what warnings they're encountering. All we did really was change the colors of the contains THC triangle to match those that are promulgated by that organization, sort of normal. And so in time, just like a stop sign is recognizable, everybody by the colors and shape of that thing will always have a common meaning across borders. There's now a requirement at 2217 that thefts in excess of $1,000 must be reported to law enforcement. That's just kind of responsive to experience. We had a surprising number of instances where people would report to us a significant loss of cannabis, and we said, well, should you tell the police about this? I said, no. So the sense is that significant losses of value in cannabis ought to be documented, ought to be known to local law enforcement so they can know that stuff is floating around, they had a criminal act. Just makes common sense, I think. There was a little bit of opposition on the community. They're going to make us, make reports, and that's going to put us in an awkward spot. It's a flexible enough rule now. I think most people know that if they took $1,000 from somebody or more, the police might get involved. So that's all there is about that one. There are some significant technical changes to 2.2.19. This is the rule about how our establishments can manage adulterated cannabis. Adulteration can happen a lot of different ways. But the two main ones that we think about are pesticide adulteration, which usually is not very innocent unless it's as a result of drift, and aspergillus adulteration, which usually is pretty innocent. It's just a fungus that is endemic in our environment, and so any crop that remains too wet for too long is at risk of developing aspergillus, and the organism creates mycotoxins. It isn't the organism itself is toxic, but its metabolic processes result in stuff that some people are not don't do well breathing. So this is really just an effort by the board to find ways to allow a remediation pathway that doesn't trick consumers. So if your product has been remediated, you ought to be able to look in the certificates, in the lab analysis certificates that you can access through those QR codes on the side of products, and you ought to be able to tell that. However, it doesn't make sense to cause waste to people if there's no public health rationale for doing that. And so what you see here is this kind of multi-path system where it is possible to remediate aspergillus contaminated cannabis, but never to sell it as flower or infused pre-roll, so it can never be smoked. Ingested orally, even if the remediation isn't very successful, eating aspergillus will not hurt you. And it's not airborne manufactured product. It's really the concern is it should not be smokable products. So that goal is achieved here. A lot of input, a lot of back and forth, but that's a fair summary of, I think, what is going on. If you've heard from constituents who are concerned about that, or if you'd like more detail about it, I can go into it, but that's all for now, unless you should more. 223 is the one location rule. One of the most basic principles of the system the General Assembly set up was they didn't want franchising. And so everyone, a person and the person's affiliates are only really meant to have one license of each type. And another simple principle that was also ordained was that they should operate in one location. You can't take one license and operate and create multiple locations. What you see in 2223B is an effort to address the unusual but not unheard of phenomenon of the farm properties that are non-adjoining. And so we heard from a few folks who had, territory that was historically used and under common ownership, but just discontiguous. You've got a field here, and then a 10th of a mile, a quarter mile down the road, you've got a farm. So this is meant to allow that sort of thing to be recognized as one location without undermining the ultimate rule, which is we don't want people franchising. It's just spinning off multiple locations. A fair bit of public input on that one will affect a very small number of people, I think, but generally in a way that I think is probably consistent with the common sense and the expectations of the General Assembly, or just letting historical farms be used for that kind of purpose. There's a clarification at 2.3.4 that a cultivator can possess cannabis products only if manufactured from their own cannabis. There's cultivators grow, they don't make products, and so they'll sometimes send their crop to be processed into products by a manufacturer, and then they may need a minute before they'll sell. They're allowed to, we've made some changes to allow them to take that product back for exactly that purpose. But what we don't want is a loophole where somebody under a cultivation license can actually act as a wholesaler. Just say, well, I'm not allowed to take product back, so I'm going to just get into trading cannabis in a sort of B2B way. We saw that pop up a few times, so that's what this change to 2.3.4C is about. Major effort to clarify the sample rules. These are samples that are given generally by upstream business partners to prospective downstream buyers so that they can evaluate the quality of the product. Samples also are sometimes given by employers to their bud tenders at retail so that they can be familiar with the product and know what they're selling.
Yes, we have a question from Representative Higley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gabe, this is kind of a process question, I guess, for all of these rules. We passed H 321, I believe it's Act 56. Is there any, there was quite a few changes in there as far as a new license, looks like extending employee licenses for 2 years, or could be. Any conflicts in the current rules that we're addressing here with what we passed in legislation?
No, one of the happy things about the timing of this was that because the legislation came down the tracks and sort of the cement dried, just as we were wrapping this up, we were able to sync them up entirely. So I'm not aware of anything in 321 that is compatible with these administrative rules. Notably, a number of proposed amendments in 321 didn't make it. And so I think the extension of the employee ID card from 1 year to 2, I think is one of the, I apologize, I'm actually reluctant to say whether or not it's in. The change of product registration from 1 year to multiple years, I know is out. So 320, another way of saying this is 321 came out, it wound up a little more modest than some of its changes, but end of the day, pretty sure it syncs up in every way with this. I don't think that this is outdated as a result of 321.
Okay, thanks, Gabe.
Sure, thank you. So we see here our efforts really just to make the sample rules simpler. They were repeated awkwardly in 4 sections, so you'll see sample rules stricken elsewhere in Rule 2. We found it better to say it clearly in once rather than unclearly in 4 times. There's a change in 2.4.2 to the fencing rule. Again, this is a effort to help small businesses and recognize the realities of security in rural areas. Often there are better deterrent systems than a fence. And if folks find it rational to use some of those, we want to be able to allow that and not require that they spend many thousands of dollars fencing an area where the fence won't provide meaningful protection. Ample room for our compliance agents to require ad hoc security measures where appropriate. So if somebody is in a more urban area where there's sidewalks around, they would have full authority to say in this particular context, you need a fence of a certain kind because of the way traffic moves around here. A small change to 2.2.4, visibility from a public road. Now ask that there be visual shielding if the cultivation site is visible by children to school within 500 feet of the site of cultivation. One of the reasons for that is in a technical sense, if some of our Harvard High School in my house is sort of the top of the hill, you can see hundreds of square miles from there. And it's not like you need a telescope, but you'd be able to see somebody's thing. Obviously, we wouldn't want to require shielding at that distance. That wouldn't make any sense. A lot of simplification around energy use reporting. This is 2.5.6. Now simply requiring that licensee retain 2 years of utility bills. That's a way to help us detect illicit cultivation that may exceed somebody's canopy limit. But almost everyone now is up and running and has been vetted for compliant equipment, and so relieving them of the requirement to reprove that every renewal when it can come out of their compliance agents makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Matter of interest to industry always is 2.6.3, the packaging. Vermont is among the only states, if not the only state, to have a total prohibition on plastic in cannabis products. The board has found it necessary to waive that prohibition in certain circumstances. For example, there's really no non-plastic solution to an effective jar seal. So It has a number of waivers that similarly, there's really no non-plastic solution in many cases to a childproof cap, just need plastic. So there are systems for that. This new rule accommodates disposable vape pens. A lot of, I think, push and pull between environmental interests, waste management interests, and industry about, do we want a world where cannabis vapes are littering our side of the roads or something? So this rule creates a little bit of room for eco-friendly pens with appropriately recyclable, removable and recyclable batteries and parts, but in general protects that the general prohibition. So more about samples that I won't go into because it's redundant with the explanation that I had given before. There's a change in 2.8.2 that's going to require that all point of sale systems have real-time reporting capacity through our API. Most of them already do, but for stragglers, there's really no IT reason or technical reason anymore remaining that their equipment couldn't. So they're being asked to do that. It helps us, with tax enforcement, helps us with inventory tracking to have that information in real time rather than to learn about it when it's uploaded from the batch. There's a subtle change to 2.8.3 about age verification. The rule as it was written was requiring some kind of very small outfits to overstaff with 2 people, even if they were just a few square feet, where one would have to greet you at the door before you ever came in and check your ID, and even if you're my age or older. And another would have to check your ID a second time at the register. And so basically, very small retail shops were having to have a doorman when it did. This changes nothing about the underlying principle. If you're under 21, you're nowhere near inside the cannabis establishments. All it does is allow small shops can have a single employee, if appropriate, who can visually just look at something and say, okay, you appear to be over 35. I don't need to stop you at the door, but you appear to be over 35. And then it's just possible to rationalize staffing that way. I know the chair has spoken with the chief prevention officer about this. I think there's no objection or concern that I'm aware of that corner. Some people looking at this from a distance may think that this is a relaxation of the ID requirement. It really it's virtually possible to get into a cannabis establishment here under 21. And it will remain so. A significant change, 2.8.3D, exercises the word statutory mandate to very clearly see that the hemp products, these are products that are not part of the seed to sale cannabis system, but rather come from hemp plants with lower THC and that aren't similarly regulated, distinguished for the consumer. So that new rule will do what the General Assembly sort of told us in our rulemaking mandate to make sure that those are clearly labeled to protect consumers. There is a provision in 2.8.11 that creates a very narrow space for drive-through, and only for medical use endorsement, retail establishments with medical use endorsements, fairly rigorous prerequisites that may be difficult to meet in many cases. Prior to offering them, the establishment would have to obtain an express written authorization from the local Cannabis Control Commission if one has been created, or from the local legislative body of the municipality. So without the blessing of officials, this wouldn't happen. Be limited to establishments that are serving medical patients. Again, you can see some security security requirements that mirror those imposed in other states. So I won't go on about that unless you have questions, but that is a non-trivial change. It used to be completely impossible to have a drive-through, now it will be possible, at least with the blessing of municipal officials, for people that can meet security requirements. 2.8.12, again, is the regulatory, or these rules simply implement the medical use endorsement that we've been talking about, that add-on to the license that would allow a cannabis, adult use cannabis establishment to serve medical patients. 2.8.14 is another one of those areas where there's really a lot of back and forth. You may have seen some of it in the public comments. This is ownership of inventory and payment terms. And so what the board is, in Vermont as elsewhere, we wound up in a situation where there was a lot of concern that retailers were overbearing cultivators and their other upstream business partners. And if you touch folks in New York, dispensary, for example, in retail, they'll say, the big secret is the store doesn't own any of this stuff. It's all on consignment. It's all sitting there. They take no risk. It just, goes, you don't get paid unless it sells. Effectively, they're renting space in their retail establishment. This causes problems when people go out of business. It also causes problems when we have regulatory recall, because when we sweep up contaminated product, we need to be able to presume that the person who took it from was the owner. And if that doesn't hold, we have a problem with phones lighting up with cultivators saying, hey, you took my stuff out of my retail establishment. How do I get it back? So this is meant to protect all the marketplace participants just by disallowing consignment and requiring that retailers take ownership of the cannabis and cannabis products acquired from other licensees. That doesn't mean they can't have accounts receivable. It doesn't mean we're in a COD world. None of that. It just means that the actual ownership of the cannabis product in a retail establishment as a legal matter must rest with the retailer. So that there's no confusion about risk if there's a seizure of product, theft of product, et cetera. So that got a lot of feedback, but again, landed in an area where I think almost all participants found acceptable. There is a change in potency parameters, 2.9.2D. Again, this is one that we've spoken with our partners in the prevention world about, so they understood what's going on there. The board has allowed higher tolerance for concentrates free of additives to avoid this paradoxical outcome that isn't really great for the public health, where something would test an inhalable concentrate would test high, even though it was developed without additives or solvents, and then that kind of natural product would then be sent back to the manufacturer to be diluted with some dilutant that people would then have in their smokable product. That's not great public health policy in any world, really. So I think the laboratories had asked us to make this change because they were saying if it were just a couple percentage points higher, we wouldn't be sending, 75 or 80% of the stuff that we send back to the head that was added to it wouldn't have to be adulterated in that way. So that's why you see that. And I think that brings us to the end of 2.11. Regulations applicable to propagation cultivators are just a verbatim cut and paste of a policy that we ran for a year between the time propagation cultivator licensing was created and the time we did this rule update. So there's, although there's a lot of text there, all of it is, the tires have been kicked, and I don't really comment concern about it. I think that brings me to the end of the substantive part of Rule 2, which is also the meat of it, 3 and 4 munchies. But if you have questions I haven't addressed, I do want to just get on the record the 2 errors called to my attention by Attorney Leonard to make sure that it's okay with you to make those changes.
Questions?
So, Mr. Chair, the 2 technical changes that I omitted from my letter there's a reference to this subdivision 2A.3.3 in subsection 2.11.3B, which we would like to correct. There's also a cross-reference in subsection 2.11.4B, which we also would like to correct. That is the reference to 2A.3.4 is incorrect and should be updated. So if you're okay with those 2, did I mangle those together?
Yeah, so no, I think you're right. So the 2A.3.3 should read 2.11.3, is that right?
Yes, I believe.
And then the 2A.3.4 should read 2.11.4, right?
I believe that's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
These are included in the letter.
They weren't included in the letter.
Okay.
So that's why he's raising them on the record. So we had an email exchange and they just got left out of the letter, so.
Yeah, that was my omission. Everything else is correct in the letter. That's related to sure.
All right, any other questions, committee? We have a motion? Yeah, I have a motion here. I move that we approve Cannabis Control Board Rule 2 Regulation of Cannabis Establishments as amended by the memorandum submitted on June 25, 2025, and also submitted in meeting today. Any questions, comments? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? That was it. Okay, let's move on to 25 PO4, which is the medical cannabis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, gentlemen,
These two rules be quicker.
yes, I promise that it gets much better from here. The second one, I wasn't sure we were going to make it. But thank you for bearing with me. So it's a lighter lift for Rule 3. This is the medical. As I was talking about in my earlier testimony on the Rules 1 and 2, we started with a medical system. The adult use system came along, and then came reconciliation of the two into a system where they're supposed to look like one another, and medical products could be available through adult use stores through this endorsement we're talking about. So almost everything you see going on in Rule 3 is just implementing those legislative changes. The change to the definition of a bona fide healthcare professional-patient relationship reflects legislation and discussion that was had about how closely sort of a continuum of rigor on which that you would decide who can be a patient and who certifies patients, and there's sort of a Goldilocks bit where you're keeping out people that shouldn't qualify, but you're not making it unduly burdensome for ill people who do qualify. That would be a political decision, but the ultimate outcomes are reflected in the new definition, which just keeps pace with the statute. A change to the applicability provisions really is just meant to address now that people have the medical use endorsement that used to be that they existed. Again, almost everything here tracing statutory changes. The board did try to carve out for itself a little bit of authority to re-scrutinize applicants whose certifying provider has proven not to be credible in some way. This happens sort of in two ways. One are these kind of certification mills online where you can go online, and if you Google, certify me for my state medical cannabis card, you can find outfits in the other states offering to just sort of let you buy a diagnosis. Obviously, that undermines the purpose of the system and threatens the program integrity. And so the board, who under the new rules, would have more authority to act if it sort of had been misled in any respect, or even if an innocent patient got from an incredible provider or certification, we'll figure that they get it from a provider that was more trustworthy. That change was prompted by, I think, the arrest on federal charges of a provider in New Hampshire who was a certifier of many of our state patients. They called it a question whether or not those patients appropriately screened. So easy to understand why they didn't want that one. And really, things are getting a lot lighter. There's provision for interpreters for people who may be hard of hearing, to allow that an interpreter may go into certain places that would otherwise be reserved for a medical patient. The biggest deal here in terms of public health and safety, and probably the biggest thing in the industry as well, is that Section 3.7 now requires that medical cannabis products be tested and registered in the same way that adult use cannabis products are. It was sort of this is a paradox that has come up in other states as well as Vermont, but we got into this kind of upside down system where there's actually more testing and regulatory scrutiny of the adult use products than the products that are being used by medically fragile people. Made no sense. It just reflected the historical development of the two programs. But the sense among everybody, I think, is it's time. We want to protect patients, and the industry said that as well. Patients should be protected at least to the same standard as adult use consumers. And these changes to 3.7 would achieve that. It would also they would also implement the intent of the General Assembly clearly expressed in recent statutes that we make these two systems look and feel and operate as much as consistently as they can. So that's what you have in 3.7.1. Clarity about how products are displayed and distinguished from adult use products. For example, the packaging on medical products is black and white only. Medical products have to be kind of under glass, can't be picked up and examined. So in that way, there should be real separation and a genuine clear distinction between the medical products and the adult use products in an establishment that has the endorsement. That I think is a fair summary of what you've got in there. If there are questions about any particular amendments, I'd be happy to take them, but that's how we got what we're doing with 3. I'm not aware of any big controversies in this.
Any questions, comments? Any? Motion?
Do that one too.
Representative?
Move that we approve Cannabis Control Board Rule 3, medical cannabis as amended by the memorandum submitted on June 25, 2025.
We have motion to approve from Representative Saxon. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Rule number 4, which is compliance and enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, for the record, Gabe Gilman, the General Counsel to the Cannabis Control Board. We're here with the board's 4th of the 4 rules today. This one concerning compliance and enforcement, and this one also, I think members may be relieved to hear, has the fewest changes. Some technical changes to recognize the addition of the propagation cultivator license type, but no real substantive change that would surprise anybody. Some changes to the definitions of prohibited acts. One for mislabeling medical products or selling medical products other than to eligible patient or caregiver. That's basically sort of an enforcement rule related to all the stuff we're trying to prevent in the prior rules. If you misuse your medical product credentials, either evade the tax or to facilitate straw purchases, you can lose your license or otherwise be sanctioned. Addition of a general sanctionable violation for conduct of a character likely to deceive, defraud, or harm the public. That catch-all language is used in the law of professional regulation with good effect to kind of just capture misbehavior that is injurious to the public health or the program integrity, but just needs to be caught, but could describe a very broad range of misconduct. And then an express prohibition on knowingly using unauthorized pesticides, soil amendments, fertilizers, or crop production aids. Here, the board is just distinguishing the knowing adulteration, which is obviously more severe in character, from accidental and negligent adulteration. And you can see the adjustment for negligence in the 4.5.2 element. So instead of treating everybody the same, looks at intent, gauges severity based on intent. New provision is added to 4.5.3. Again, this is just an enforcement arm of something that we already talked about. It allows us to treat as a violation failure to maintain the governing documents as we talked about in Rule 1. We removed the reference to temporary work permits because they will no longer exist in the system. The most substantive changes are really to the procedural Rule 4.6.1. There was a little bit of nervousness that really mostly out of my office that we didn't have a great deal of process and structure around what happens when product is either seized or put on stop sale or somebody gets a cease and desist order. We want to make sure that they are able to promptly seek review. Because those are sort of summary actions, we want to make sure that they are entitled to board review promptly in case staff didn't do something, the judge the situation differently, the board judges it. And we want to ensure that due process is afforded to the person subject to those orders. And so this just sets up a system where there can be a hurry up hearing within 72 hours as to why an order should be modified, stay vacated. So just giving a little structure to what happens when things go wrong. There's a product seizure.
And that brings us to the end of 4, I think, unless you have questions about the rest of the text, that's the whole thing.
Any members? Questions, comments? I have none, so is there a motion?
I move that we approve Cannabis Control Board Rule 4, compliance and enforcement as amended by the memorandum submitted in June of 26, 2025.
I have a motion from Senator Beck to adopt the rule. Any discussion, comments? Saying none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very much.
Okay, well, thank you for your time this morning.
Great. Appreciate the comprehensive review.
Appreciate your patience. It's a long one.
Well, it's a new area. It's important. Thank you. We have no other business. Next meeting is July 10th. Currently, we have 6 rules, correct? We have 2 that are on your list, and then we have 4.
They are on the back.
All around the back, okay.
Okay, that's
Or Fisher, Wildlife, do you have those today?
I do, yeah. Here, and I can distribute.
Okay, so you take your copies with you.
Yep.
I haven't gotten into the rules. A lot of times Fish and Wildlife rules can be controversial, so we'll see. We'll go from there. So my next meeting on 7/10, is anyone planning on not being here for that meeting? Do you know of right now? Okay, great. All right, thanks. This meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So you said there were a couple